For over 1,000 years, Constantinople was considered unconquerable. Its mighty walls defeated Persians, Arabs, Bulgars, Rus, and countless other invaders. Yet, in the spring of 1453, everything changed. Welcome to Mystery Sleep Forget. Tonight, we'll journey from the glory of the last Roman capital to its dramatic final days and uncover how one of history's greatest cities finally fell. If you're listening from somewhere around the world, let us know in the comments and settle in for tonight's story. There are cities that become rich. There are cities that become powerful. And then there are cities that seem to rise beyond ordinary history and become something closer to a legend. For more than 1,000 years, Constantinople belonged to that rare category. Long before its final fall would shock the world, long before cannons thundered against its walls and armies gathered outside its gates, the city stood as one of humanity's greatest achievements, a place so wealthy, so heavily defended, and so strategically positioned that generations of rulers came to believe it might never truly be conquered. To understand why the fall of Constantinople felt almost unimaginable to those who witnessed it, we first have to understand why so many people believed the city was destined to survive forever. The story begins with geography, because geography often determines history long before kings, emperors, or armies arrive. At the narrow strait known as the Bosphorus, Europe and Asia nearly touch. Ships moving between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean had little choice but to pass through this corridor. Grain from fertile plains, silk from distant markets, spices from Asia, timber from northern forests, precious metals, furs, wine, and countless other goods flowed through these waters. Whoever controlled this crossing possessed influence over one of the most important commercial routes in the known world. It was an advantage capable of generating wealth, power, and strategic leverage at the same time. When Emperor Constantine selected the ancient city of Byzantium as the site of a new imperial capital in the 4th century, he was not simply choosing a beautiful location. He was recognizing a reality that would shape history for more than 1,000 years. In 330 AD, Constantinople was officially dedicated as the new center of imperial power. Rome remained prestigious, but the eastern provinces were increasingly wealthy and economically dynamic. Constantine understood that the future of the empire was shifting eastward. His new capital stood at the crossroads of continents, protected by water on multiple sides and positioned perfectly to benefit from expanding trade networks. Nature itself seemed to have designed the site with defense in mind. Yet, geography alone does not create greatness. Many cities occupy favorable locations. Few become legends. Over the centuries that followed, emperors poured enormous resources into transforming Constantinople into something extraordinary. Palaces expanded across the landscape. Harbors grew busier. Markets became larger. Churches rose toward the sky. Wealth accumulated on a scale that astonished visitors from across the medieval world. During its greatest centuries, Constantinople was not merely one of the largest cities in Europe. It was often larger than nearly every city in Europe combined. At a time when London, Paris, and many other famous cities were still relatively modest urban centers, Constantinople may have housed hundreds of thousands of residents. Medieval travelers arriving from the West frequently struggled to comprehend what they were seeing. The city seemed endless. Streets stretched through districts filled with merchants, craftsmen, officials, pilgrims, sailors, scholars, and diplomats. Ships crowded the harbors in astonishing numbers. Languages from across Europe, North Africa, the Middle East, and Central Asia echoed through its marketplaces. In many ways, Constantinople functioned as the New York, London, and Dubai of the medieval world all at once. It was a financial center, a political center, a religious center, and a gateway between continents. Wealth flowed into the city from every direction. Luxury goods passed through its markets. Gold filled its treasury. Precious relics attracted pilgrims. Foreign ambassadors attended elaborate ceremonies designed to leave them overwhelmed by imperial splendor. Some visitors describe palaces decorated with gold, silver, mosaics, and mechanical devices so unusual they seemed almost magical. While medieval writers occasionally exaggerated, there is little doubt that Constantinople possessed extraordinary resources. The city projected power through spectacle. It wanted visitors to leave believing they had witnessed the center of civilization itself. One of the clearest examples of this ambition could be found in the Great Palace, the vast imperial complex overlooking the Sea of Marmara. For centuries, Byzantine emperors ruled from this sprawling collection of halls, courtyards, gardens, chapels, and ceremonial chambers. Foreign envoys walking through its corridors encountered displays carefully designed to communicate authority. Every detail reinforced a simple message. The emperor ruled not merely a kingdom, but the continuation of Rome itself. Nearby stood another symbol of imperial confidence, the Hippodrome. More than a sporting arena, it functioned as one of the city's social and political hearts. Tens of thousands of spectators gathered there to watch chariot races, celebrate victories, and witness public ceremonies. Rival factions cheered their teams with extraordinary passion. Emperors addressed crowds from elevated platforms. Political tensions sometimes erupted into violence. The Hippodrome was where the empire displayed itself to its people, and where the people occasionally reminded the empire of their own power. Yet even these impressive structures were overshadowed by the building that came to define Constantinople more than any other. When Emperor Justinian completed Hagia Sophia in the 6th century, many observers struggled to describe what they were seeing. Its massive dome appeared to float above the building. Sunlight poured through rows of windows, illuminating gold mosaics and creating an atmosphere that visitors often described in almost spiritual terms. Some accounts suggest that foreign envoys left the structure convinced they had witnessed something beyond ordinary architecture. Whether those reactions were exaggerated or not, they reveal an important truth. Hagia Sophia was designed to inspire awe. It communicated confidence, permanence, and divine favor. To many people throughout the medieval world, the building symbolized the greatness of Constantinople itself. Yet, if the city's churches inspired admiration, its defenses inspired fear. The Theodosian Walls became one of the most successful fortification systems ever constructed. Built during the 5th century, they protected the vulnerable western approach to the city through multiple layers of defense. Deep ditches slowed attackers. Outer walls absorbed assaults. Massive inner walls, reinforced by towers, created another formidable barrier behind them. The design transformed any attack into a nightmare. An invading army might overcome one obstacle only to discover another waiting immediately beyond it. The walls were not merely large, they were brilliantly engineered. More importantly, they worked. Century after century, invading armies tested them and failed. Persians threatened the city and failed. Arab armies launched repeated sieges and failed. Bulgars challenged Byzantine power and failed. Rus raiders arrived from the north and failed. Again and again, enemies approached, believing they might finally achieve victory. Again and again, they retreated, disappointed. Every failed siege strengthened the city's reputation. Every surviving generation added another chapter to its legend. Over time, Constantinople became known not simply as a strong city, but as an unconquerable one. The sea reinforced that reputation. Along the northern side of the city stretched the Golden Horn, one of the finest natural harbors in the world. Merchant ships could anchor safely under the protection of the city's defenses. During times of danger, a massive iron chain could be stretched across the harbor entrance, preventing hostile fleets from entering. An enemy approaching Constantinople faced challenge after challenge. Water protected much of the coastline. Walls protected the land. The harbor could be sealed. Supplies could still arrive by sea. It was difficult to imagine a more defensible location. Yet, there was another weapon hidden within the Byzantine arsenal. One so mysterious that historians still debate its exact composition today. Known as Greek fire, it became one of the most feared military technologies of the medieval world. Contemporary accounts suggest it could be projected from ships and continued burning even when it touched water. Modern scholars have proposed various explanations involving petroleum-based substances, but no universally accepted formula has been reconstructed. Whatever its precise composition, Greek fire terrified opponents. Imagine approaching the city by sea, only to witness flames spreading across the water itself. Whether later accounts embellished certain details or not, the weapon reinforced a powerful belief. Constantinople possessed advantages unavailable to its enemies. It was protected not only by walls and fleets, but by knowledge outsiders could not easily obtain. This combination of geography, wealth, engineering, religion, trade, and military innovation created something remarkably rare in history. It created confidence. Not just confidence among emperors and generals, but confidence across entire generations. People came to assume the city would always survive. After all, what city could rival its wealth? What city possessed stronger defenses? What city had defeated so many enemies for so many centuries? Success itself became part of its defense. Potential invaders hesitated. Allies looked to the city as a symbol of stability. Even rivals often admired it. Constantinople appeared less like a temporary political creation and more like a permanent feature of the world. Yet history rarely rewards certainty forever. The same centuries that strengthened Constantinople were transforming the lands beyond its horizon. New powers were emerging. New military technologies were developing. Trade routes were shifting. Political pressures were growing. Most importantly, challenges were beginning to appear that walls alone could not solve. Fortifications can stop armies. They cannot stop economic decline. They cannot stop political division. They cannot stop demographic change. They cannot stop time. To visitors arriving during its golden age, however, such dangers remained invisible. The city still gleamed beneath the sun. Merchant vessels still crowded its harbors. Hagia Sophia still dominated the skyline. The hippodrome still echoed with crowds. The walls still towered above the landscape like a monument to permanence itself. Few people could imagine a future in which the Queen of Cities would ever truly fall. But hidden beneath the appearance of eternal strength, forces were already beginning to shape a different future. And those forces would eventually prove far more dangerous than any army waiting outside the gates. For centuries, the city seemed untouchable. Its walls still stood. Its churches still dominated the skyline. Merchant ships still crossed the waters surrounding it. To an outsider arriving by sea, Constantinople could continue to appear as the capital of a mighty empire. Yet, appearances can be deceptive. Some of the most dramatic collapses in history happen slowly, almost invisibly, long before anyone recognizes what is taking place. Empires rarely vanish in a single moment. More often, they shrink piece by piece, territory by territory, generation after generation, until one day people realize that what once ruled continents now struggles to control its own horizon. That was the story unfolding around Constantinople. The city that had once commanded vast provinces stretching across Europe, Asia, and parts of Africa was gradually becoming something very different. The process did not happen overnight, and that may be why it proved so difficult to stop. In the centuries following its greatest period of power, the Byzantine Empire faced the challenge familiar to many long-lived states. Success had created complexity. Complexity required administration. Administration required money. And money depended on stable trade, productive farmland, loyal populations, and effective leadership. When several of those elements began to weaken at the same time, the empire found itself under growing pressure from multiple directions. Powerful neighbors emerged along its borders. Internal political rivalries consumed resources. Economic disruptions rippled through regions that had once generated enormous wealth. None of these problems seemed fatal on their own. Together, however, they created a slow-moving crisis that lasted for centuries. One of the most important turning points came during the 11th century. For generations, Byzantine rulers had relied on provinces in Anatolia, much of modern-day Turkey, as a source of manpower, agricultural production, and strategic depth. These lands formed the empire's heartland. Losing them would be comparable to a modern nation losing one of its most productive regions. Then came the Battle of Manzikert in 1071. Historians continued debating exactly how decisive the battle itself was, but its consequences proved profound. After the Byzantine defeat, Turkish groups gradually expanded into large portions of Anatolia. The process unfolded over decades rather than instantly, yet the result was transformative. Lands that had long supplied resources to Constantinople increasingly slipped beyond imperial control. What made this development particularly dangerous was that its full impact was not immediately obvious. The city still stood. The emperor still ruled. Trade continued. Yet the foundations supporting imperial power had begun to erode. It was like watching a massive tree lose portions of its root system while its trunk remained standing. From a distance, the tree still appeared healthy. The damage was occurring below the surface. As pressure increased, Byzantine rulers searched desperately for solutions. One response would reshape relations between East and West in ways few could have predicted. Seeking military assistance against advancing enemies, Emperor Alexios I Komnenos appealed to Western Europe. His request helped contribute to events that became known as the First Crusade. Initially, cooperation produced mixed results. Some territory was recovered. Certain threats were reduced. Yet, beneath the surface, tensions between the Byzantine world and Western European powers continued to grow. Cultural differences, religious disagreements, political rivalries, and competing ambitions created mistrust on all sides. What began as an uneasy partnership gradually evolved into something far more complicated. Then came one of the most shocking events in medieval history. In 1204, during the Fourth Crusade, an army originally intended to fight elsewhere turned its attention toward Constantinople itself. The result stunned contemporaries and continues to fascinate historians today. Christian crusaders attacked the largest Christian city in the eastern Mediterranean. They breached its defenses, entered the city, and subjected it to a devastating sack. Churches were looted. Palaces were plundered. Priceless treasures disappeared. Relics accumulated over centuries were carried away. The psychological impact may have been even greater than the material destruction. For generations, Constantinople had presented itself as the guardian of a civilization. Suddenly, it had been violated by forces that were not supposed to be its enemies. Some historians have argued that 1204 represented the true beginning of the end. The empire would eventually recover the city, but many scholars believe it never fully recovered its former strength. Whether that interpretation goes too far remains debated. Yet few dispute the scale of the damage. It is difficult to overstate how traumatic the event must have felt to those who experienced it. Imagine a city long regarded as nearly invincible suddenly seeing its streets filled with foreign soldiers. Imagine institutions that had endured for centuries abruptly collapsing. Imagine realizing that the greatest threat had not come from distant rivals, but from those who claimed to share your faith. When Byzantine forces eventually regained Constantinople in 1261, they reclaimed a capital that was still magnificent but no longer dominant. The city retained enormous symbolic importance, yet the world around it had changed. Economic power increasingly shifted toward maritime republics such as Venice and Genoa. These Italian trading powers established extensive commercial networks and accumulated influence throughout the eastern Mediterranean. Their ships dominated important trade routes. Their merchants gained privileges inside Byzantine territory. In some cases, foreign commercial interests became so influential that they effectively controlled portions of economic activity that had once strengthened the empire itself. Constantinople remained a major center of trade, but increasingly it was sharing benefits that previous generations had largely controlled. Political instability added another layer of difficulty. Imperial succession disputes, rival claimants, civil wars, and elite power struggles repeatedly weakened the state. Such conflicts often consumed resources that could have been used to strengthen defenses or rebuild institutions. At times, Byzantine leaders appeared trapped in a cycle where short-term political survival took priority over long-term strategic stability. Similar patterns have appeared throughout history. External threats attract attention, yet internal divisions frequently prove just as dangerous. An enemy outside the walls is visible. An enemy created by factional rivalry can be much harder to confront. As decades passed, the contrast between Constantinople's reputation and its reality became increasingly striking. Visitors still encountered magnificent monuments. Hagia Sophia still inspired awe. The walls still projected strength. Yet, beyond the famous landmarks, signs of decline were becoming more noticeable. Population levels fell compared to earlier centuries. Some districts contained abandoned buildings. Areas that had once been densely developed reportedly included gardens, fields, and open spaces. Certain travelers described portions of the city that felt surprisingly empty for a capital that had once dominated the medieval world. These accounts should not be exaggerated into a picture of complete ruin. Constantinople remained one of the most impressive cities in the region, but the difference between its legendary image and its actual condition was growing larger. This contrast may help explain why many contemporaries struggled to understand the danger. Symbols of greatness remained visible everywhere. The deeper problems were less obvious. The empire continued shrinking. Territories were lost. Revenues declined. Military resources became increasingly limited. Meanwhile, new powers continued rising around its borders. Among them was a relatively young state that began as one of many regional players, but steadily expanded through a combination of military success, strategic leadership, and favorable circumstances. This emerging power was the Ottoman state. During the late 13th and 14th centuries, the Ottomans expanded across northwestern Anatolia and then into southeastern Europe. Each victory increased their resources. Each conquest strengthened their position. From the perspective of Constantinople, the situation became increasingly alarming. Lands that had once served as buffers disappeared. Neighboring regions fell under Ottoman influence. Gradually, the empire's remaining territories became fragmented and isolated. By the early 15th century, a remarkable transformation had occurred. What had once been the Eastern Roman Empire had effectively become a small state centered largely on Constantinople and a handful of scattered possessions. The city still possessed immense historical prestige. It still carried the legacy of Rome. It still stood behind walls that had resisted countless enemies. Yet the empire surrounding it had shrunk dramatically. In a sense, the title of this chapter had become reality. The Roman Empire had been reduced, almost unbelievably, to little more than a city and its immediate surroundings. Looking at a map from this period can feel almost surreal. The state that had once stretched across continents now appeared as a collection of isolated fragments surrounded by stronger neighbors. And yet, Constantinople continued to endure. That endurance is one reason its story remains so compelling. Even in decline, the city refused to disappear. even as resources diminished, its people adapted. Even as opportunities narrowed, hope survived. But history was moving toward a confrontation unlike any the city had faced before. Because while Constantinople had spent centuries surviving powerful enemies, a new generation of rulers was emerging beyond its walls. They possessed growing resources, expanding territory, and ambitions that reached far beyond ordinary conquest. And among them was a young leader who would soon become obsessed with achieving what countless kings, generals, caliphs, and emperors had failed to accomplish. The city still stood. The walls still stood. The legend still stood. But for the first time in centuries, the balance of power was no longer moving in Constantinople's favor. There is a particular kind of tragedy that unfolds so slowly that the people living through it may not fully recognize it until it is nearly complete. It does not arrive with a single battle, a single disaster, or a single dramatic turning point. Instead, it reveals itself through small changes that accumulate over decades. Streets become quieter. Buildings remain unrepaired. Wealth becomes harder to find. Opportunities grow fewer. The familiar remains visible, yet something essential begins to fade beneath the surface. By the early 15th century, this was the reality facing Constantinople. The city still possessed its famous walls. Hagia Sophia still dominated the skyline. Foreign visitors could still marvel at monuments that had survived for centuries. Yet, behind the image of greatness stood a city carrying the weight of a long decline. What made the situation remarkable was not that Constantinople had become weak. It was that it still existed at all. Few capitals in history have endured so many crises and remained standing. Yet, survival itself can sometimes disguise the depth of a problem. A patient who survives repeated illnesses may appear resilient while quietly growing weaker. In many ways, Constantinople had entered a similar stage of its history. The empire surrounding it had shrunk dramatically, but the city continued to project the memory of a world that no longer existed. Travelers arriving at its gates encountered a strange contradiction. Some parts of the city remained breathtaking. Massive churches, ancient forums, monasteries, towers, and public buildings reminded visitors of a glorious past. Yet, scattered among these landmarks were signs of decline that could not easily be ignored. Areas that had once housed dense populations contained abandoned structures. Empty lots appeared where neighborhoods had once flourished. In some districts, gardens and small agricultural plots occupied spaces that earlier generations would have considered valuable urban land. Contemporary accounts vary in detail, but several observers described a city that felt larger than the population living inside it. Constantinople had not physically shrunk to match its reduced circumstances. Instead, it resembled a giant shell built for an age of greater power. This created an almost haunting atmosphere. Imagine walking through a city designed for hundreds of thousands of people while encountering only a fraction of that number. Imagine passing enormous structures whose scale reflected ambitions from centuries earlier. The contrast between past and present was impossible to miss. Some historians have compared late Byzantine Constantinople to a museum of its own history. The city remained impressive, but much of its grandeur came from achievements inherited rather than newly created. That distinction mattered. Great monuments can preserve memory, but they cannot solve economic problems. They cannot fill an empty treasury. They cannot recruit soldiers. They cannot reverse demographic decline. One of the most significant challenges facing the city was population loss. Exact numbers remain debated, and medieval population estimates are notoriously difficult to determine with precision. But many scholars agree that Constantinople housed far fewer residents in the 15th century than during its greatest centuries. War, disease, economic instability, migration, and political disruption all contributed to this transformation. The Black Death, which swept across large portions of Europe, the Middle East, and Asia during the 14th century, almost certainly intensified existing pressures. Although historians continue studying the exact demographic impact in different regions, there is little doubt that repeated outbreaks of plague reshaped societies throughout the medieval world. Constantinople was not immune. Every major epidemic removed workers, merchants, craftsmen, taxpayers, and soldiers from a system already under strain. Recovery became increasingly difficult because new crises often arrived before older wounds had fully healed. Economic challenges followed naturally. Large cities require resources. Roads must function. Harbors must operate. Defenses must be maintained. Officials must be paid. Religious institutions must be supported. When population declines and territory shrinks, generating sufficient revenue becomes far more difficult. The Byzantine government spent centuries balancing competing priorities with limited resources. Every coin directed toward one problem could not be spent elsewhere. Repairs were delayed. Investments became more selective. Military expenditures competed with administrative necessities. In some ways, the empire found itself trapped by its own history. It remained responsible for maintaining institutions built during a period of much greater wealth. The burden was enormous. Yet, perhaps the most visible symbol of decline was not economic, but military. Constantinople's legendary walls still stood, but walls are only as effective as the people defending them. During earlier centuries, the empire could draw manpower from extensive territories. By the 15th century, those resources had diminished dramatically. Recruiting and maintaining large professional forces became increasingly difficult. The city still possessed defenders, but nothing comparable to the military strength available during its peak. This reality produced a dangerous paradox. The defenses remained famous. The manpower supporting them had become far more limited. Some historians argue that the city's greatest advantage during this period was psychological. Potential enemies continued respecting Constantinople's reputation long after its actual capabilities had weakened. Legends created caution. Caution bought time. Time extended survival. Yet even legends eventually encounter reality. Foreign influence added another layer of complexity. Venetian and Genoese merchants maintained significant commercial interests in the region. Their ships dominated important trade routes. Their colonies and trading posts stretched across strategic locations. At times, these relationships benefited Constantinople. At other times, they highlighted how much the balance of economic power had shifted. There was a subtle irony in the situation. The city that had once stood at the center of international commerce increasingly depended on partnerships with maritime powers that often pursued their own interests first. Economic cooperation and political necessity became deeply intertwined. The empire needed allies, but dependence on allies carried risks of its own. Meanwhile, daily life continued. This is one of the most fascinating aspects of history. Even during periods of decline, ordinary people still marry, raise families, work, worship, trade, argue, celebrate, and plan for the future. A baker opening his shop in Constantinople could not spend every morning contemplating the fate of an empire. A merchant negotiating prices still needed customers. Monks continued copying manuscripts. Sailors continued loading cargo. Children continued growing up beneath the shadow of ancient monuments. The city was not simply a symbol of decline. It was a living place inhabited by real people navigating uncertain circumstances. That human reality often disappears behind discussions of emperors and wars, yet it may be one of the most important parts of the story. For many residents, life probably felt neither triumphant nor catastrophic. It simply felt normal. And sometimes, history's greatest transformations occur while ordinary life appears surprisingly unchanged. What makes late Constantinople particularly compelling is that the city retained an extraordinary ability to inspire belief. Foreign visitors still wrote about its beauty. Religious pilgrims still regarded it as sacred. Its walls still impressed observers. Hagia Sophia still dominated the skyline with breathtaking authority. Even after centuries of decline, Constantinople remained one of the most recognizable cities in the world. This raises an intriguing question. How much of a state's power comes from physical resources, and how much comes from perception? Reputation can influence diplomacy. Reputation can deter enemies. Reputation can attract support. Constantinople possessed an immense reservoir of symbolic power. The challenge was that symbolic power alone could not permanently compensate for shrinking resources. The gap between image and reality was gradually widening. Beyond the walls, another transformation was taking place. While Constantinople struggled to preserve what remained, neighboring powers continued expanding. None proved more significant than the Ottoman state. Over generations, Ottoman rulers consolidated territory, strengthened institutions, developed military capabilities, and expanded their influence across both Anatolia and southeastern Europe. What made this process especially dangerous from Constantinople's perspective was its consistency. Expansion did not depend entirely on a single ruler or a single campaign. Success generated resources. Resources enabled further success. The cycle reinforced itself. By the early 15th century, the contrast between the two states had become striking. One represented the surviving remnant of an ancient imperial system. The other represented a rising power still building momentum. History does not always favor youth over age, but momentum matters. Energy matters. Resources matter. Leadership matters. Increasingly, those advantages appeared to be shifting away from Constantinople. Yet despite everything, the city endured. That endurance remains one of the most remarkable aspects of the story. Lesser states had vanished under far less pressure. Lesser capitals had disappeared entirely. Constantinople continued standing against the current of history itself. Perhaps that persistence encouraged hope. Perhaps it encouraged denial. Perhaps it encouraged both at the same time. Because if a city has survived for 1,000 years, it becomes difficult to imagine that its final chapter could truly arrive. And yet, the signs were becoming harder to ignore. The population was smaller. The treasury was weaker. The empire was fragmented. The military was limited. Powerful rivals surrounded the city. The old world that had sustained Constantinople for centuries was disappearing. What remained was a magnificent survivor, proud and resilient, but increasingly isolated. The remarkable question was no longer whether the city had declined. The remarkable question was how much longer it could continue defying the odds. Beyond the horizon, a new generation of leaders was already imagining an answer. Among them was a young Ottoman prince whose ambitions extended far beyond ordinary conquest. Unlike many rulers before him, he did not merely wish to threaten Constantinople, pressure it, or profit from its weakness. He dreamed of capturing it. And unlike countless predecessors who had made the same dream their goal, he would soon possess the resources, determination, and vision to turn that dream into a serious possibility. History often remembers great cities through the moment they fall, but much less attention is given to the people who spend years imagining how such a fall might happen. Long before soldiers assemble, before cannons fire, before walls are tested, someone must first believe that the impossible is possible. In the middle of the 15th century, that person was Mehmed II. To many observers at the time, he appeared too young, too ambitious, and perhaps too inexperienced to accomplish what generations of rulers before him had failed to achieve. Yet history has a habit of being shaped by individuals who refuse to accept the limits that others consider obvious. By the time Mehmed came to power, Constantinople had already survived countless threats. Arab armies had failed. Powerful kings had failed. Emperors, generals, and warlords had all dreamed of taking the city. The sheer number of failed attempts had become part of its reputation. Conquering Constantinople was not simply difficult. It had acquired an aura of impossibility. And that reputation may have been one of the reasons Mehmed found the challenge so compelling. Born in 1432, Mehmed entered a world already shaped by Ottoman expansion. Unlike earlier generations of Ottoman rulers who spent much of their reigns establishing foundations, Mehmed inherited a state that was becoming one of the dominant powers of its region. Ottoman armies controlled large portions of Anatolia and southeastern Europe. Their territories surrounded Constantinople on multiple sides. Trade routes increasingly passed through lands under Ottoman influence. Military resources were growing. Administrative institutions were maturing. The balance of power that had once favored Byzantium had shifted dramatically. Yet one obstacle remained standing in the middle of this expanding Ottoman world. Constantinople was no longer the center of a vast empire, but its symbolic importance remained immense. The city represented far more than territory. It carried centuries of history, prestige, and legitimacy. To capture it would not simply be a military victory, it would be a statement. Understanding Mehmed requires looking beyond the image of a young conqueror and examining the environment that shaped him. Contemporary accounts suggest he possessed an unusual level of intellectual curiosity. He studied languages, history, geography, military strategy, and political theory. Different sources vary in their descriptions, and some later accounts undoubtedly enhanced his reputation. But a broad consensus exists that Mehmed was highly educated by the standards of his time. He reportedly showed interest in both Islamic and classical traditions. This detail matters because Constantinople was not merely a target on a map. It was the former capital of the Roman Empire, a city whose name echoed across centuries. For someone fascinated by history, the city carried enormous symbolic weight. Capturing it would place him among the most significant rulers of his age. Yet, ambition alone does not explain his determination. Religion may also have played an important role. Certain Islamic traditions included references interpreted by many believers as predicting the eventual conquest of Constantinople. The exact significance of these traditions has been discussed and debated by scholars for centuries, but there is little doubt that the idea held powerful appeal within parts of the Islamic world. The city had resisted numerous Muslim armies in earlier centuries. Conquering it carried not only strategic benefits, but also religious prestige. Whether Mehmed viewed himself primarily through this lens, or whether political considerations mattered more, remains a subject of historical discussion. Most likely, the answer involved a combination of motivations rather than a single explanation. Human decisions, especially those that shape history, are rarely driven by one factor alone. Whatever his reasoning, one thing appears increasingly clear as we examine the evidence. Mehmed did not see Constantinople as an optional objective. He saw it as unfinished business. The city's location alone made it difficult to ignore. Although Ottoman territories surrounded it, Constantinople remained politically independent. It sat astride crucial waterways and occupied a position capable of influencing movement between different parts of the Ottoman realm. From a strategic perspective, allowing the city to remain outside Ottoman control created complications. As long as Constantinople survived, it retained the potential to serve as a diplomatic focal point for enemies seeking alliances against Ottoman interests. It also remained a powerful symbol around which opposition could theoretically gather. Geography, politics, prestige, religion, and history were all pointing toward the same conclusion. The city needed to be addressed. Yet many experienced observers remained skeptical. The walls had stood for centuries. The city's defenses were legendary. Previous failures provided plenty of reasons for caution. Some likely assumed that Mehmed would eventually abandon the idea, as so many others had done before him. If he heard such doubts, they seemed to have strengthened rather than weakened his resolve. One of the most revealing aspects of Mehmed's character was his willingness to think beyond established assumptions. Rather than asking whether Constantinople had resisted previous attacks, he focused on why those attacks had failed. That distinction may sound subtle, but it represents a fundamentally different approach. Many rulers saw an unconquerable city. Mehmed saw a problem waiting to be solved. Every failed siege contained lessons. Every defensive advantage could be studied. Every weakness could be examined. This mindset helps explain why he spent years preparing, rather than rushing toward immediate confrontation. Successful commanders often recognize that victory begins long before a battle starts. Preparation creates possibilities that courage alone cannot provide. One of Mehmed's earliest strategic moves involved tightening control around Constantinople itself. In 1452, construction began on the fortress known today as Rumeli Hisarı, built on the European side of the Bosphorus. Its location was carefully chosen. Together with an existing Ottoman fortress across the strait, it allowed the Ottomans to exert greater control over maritime traffic moving through the Bosphorus. The project was completed with remarkable speed. More importantly, it demonstrated intent. This was not the action of a ruler casually considering a future campaign. It was the action of someone systematically shaping the conditions necessary for success. Contemporary observers understood the message. Constantinople understood it as well. The city watched as Ottoman preparations became increasingly difficult to ignore. Yet perhaps the most fascinating aspect of Mehmed's preparations was his relationship with innovation. The 15th century was an era in which gunpowder technology was beginning to transform warfare across multiple regions. Traditional fortifications remained formidable, but military engineers were developing new ways to challenge them. The implications were profound. For centuries, walls had dominated siege warfare. Suddenly, emerging technologies raised questions about whether those assumptions would continue to hold true. Historians sometimes describe this period as a transitional moment between different military eras. Mehmed appears to have recognized that transition earlier than many of his contemporaries. He was not content to rely solely on existing methods. He actively sought new solutions. This willingness to embrace technological change would become one of the defining features of the campaign that followed. At the same time, it would be an oversimplification to portray Mehmed as relying exclusively on technology. His greatest strength may have been his ability to combine multiple advantages simultaneously. He possessed manpower, he possessed resources, he possessed strategic positioning, he possessed determination. He possessed a growing state capable of supporting large-scale military operations. Technology became one element within a much broader system. The closer we examine the situation, the more the outcome begins to look less like a sudden gamble and more like the result of long-term planning. Yet even with all these advantages, uncertainty remained. History is filled with campaigns that appeared inevitable before they began and disastrous after they ended. Mehmed could prepare extensively, but preparation offered no guarantees. Constantinople still possessed walls unlike any other city. It still commanded respect. It still represented a challenge that had humbled generations of ambitious rulers. Perhaps that uncertainty made the goal even more attractive. Some objectives derive their value precisely from their difficulty. Capturing an ordinary city would bring rewards. Capturing Constantinople would bring immortality. As the months passed, preparations accelerated. Resources were gathered. Plans were refined. Military forces were organized. Across the region, people sensed that something significant was approaching. The city watched. The Ottomans watched. Allies and rivals watched. Everyone understood the stakes. If Constantinople survived again, its legend would grow stronger than ever. If it fell, one of the longest chapters in world history would close forever. Standing at the center of this unfolding drama was a young ruler barely in his early 20s, convinced that he could accomplish what others could not. Whether that confidence reflected genius, ambition, youthful overconfidence, or some combination of all three remained unclear. What was clear was that Mehmed had moved beyond dreaming. The time for imagining possibilities was ending. The time for testing them was about to begin. And somewhere beyond the horizon, engineers were already working on a weapon so large, so ambitious, and so unprecedented that it would soon force the defenders of Constantinople to confront a question their ancestors had rarely needed to ask. What happens when the walls that protected a city for 1,000 years finally meet a threat they were never designed to face? For centuries, the walls had been the final answer. Kings could raise larger armies. Admirals could assemble greater fleets. Generals could devise more ambitious strategies. Yet sooner or later, they all faced the same reality. The massive fortifications protecting Constantinople were designed for endurance. They absorbed punishment. They frustrated attackers. They transformed military campaigns into tests of patience, resources, and morale. Entire generations grew up believing that these walls represented one of the greatest defensive achievements in human history. And in many ways, they were right. The remarkable thing is that the walls had not survived because they were lucky. They had survived because they worked. But by the middle of the 15th century, something was changing in the nature of warfare itself. Across Europe and the Islamic world, gunpowder weapons were gradually becoming more sophisticated. The process was uneven, experimental, and often unpredictable. Yet the direction was becoming increasingly clear. For centuries, engineers had designed fortifications to resist ladders, battering rams, siege towers, and traditional siege engines. Now, they faced a new challenge. What if an attacker could simply smash sections of a wall apart from a distance? The question was no longer theoretical, and at the center of that question stood a man whose name still appears in discussions of the fall of Constantinople: Orban. Historical sources differ on some details of his life. He is often described as a skilled founder or engineer, possibly of Hungarian origin, though certain aspects of his background remain debated. What seems more widely accepted is that he possessed expertise in casting large cannons during a period when such skills were becoming increasingly valuable. According to several historical accounts, Orban initially approached the Byzantine authorities and offered his services. If those accounts are accurate, the irony is extraordinary. The empire desperately needed military innovation, yet its financial situation was so strained that it struggled to support major projects. Whether Byzantine officials underestimated the opportunity, lacked sufficient funds, or faced other practical limitations remains uncertain. What is clear is that Orban eventually entered Ottoman service. There, he found a ruler willing to invest heavily in ambitious ideas. Mehmed was interested in possibilities that others considered unrealistic. He wanted something larger than ordinary artillery. He wanted something capable of challenging walls that had resisted attack for centuries. The result would become one of the most famous weapons of the medieval world. Descriptions of the Great Bombard vary somewhat among surviving sources, but there is broad agreement that it was enormous by the standards of its era. Some accounts suggest the cannon measured over 20 feet in length and fired massive stone projectiles weighing hundreds of kilograms. Even allowing for the tendency of medieval chroniclers to emphasize extraordinary details, the weapon was clearly exceptional. Transporting it required enormous effort. Teams of oxen and large numbers of workers moved it across difficult terrain. Roads sometimes needed reinforcement. Bridges required careful planning. Logistics became a challenge almost as significant as construction itself. The weapon was not merely a cannon, it was a demonstration of industrial capability, organizational power, and political determination. Every mile it traveled sent a message. The Ottomans were preparing for something unprecedented. It is easy for modern audiences, surrounded by advanced technology, to underestimate the psychological impact of such a machine. Imagine hearing reports of a weapon unlike anything your ancestors had ever faced. Imagine knowing that the walls protecting your city were built generations before the widespread use of large gunpowder artillery. No one could be entirely certain what would happen when these new weapons finally arrived. The uncertainty itself was powerful. Fear often grows in the space between expectation and reality. Yet the story becomes even more interesting when we examine the actual capabilities of these giant cannons. Popular retellings sometimes create the impression that the great bombards single-handedly destroyed Constantinople's defenses. Reality appears more complicated. The cannon was undoubtedly impressive. It generated tremendous force. Contemporary accounts describe thunderous explosions that could be heard at great distances. Massive stone projectiles struck walls that had stood for centuries. Yet the weapon also suffered from significant limitations. Reloading was slow. Firing rates were low. Accuracy was imperfect. Mechanical failures posed constant risks. Some large cannons of the era occasionally cracked or burst under the stresses created by repeated firing. In other words, the weapon was powerful, but far from perfect. This raises an intriguing question. If giant cannons had obvious weaknesses, why did they matter so much? The answer may lie less in individual shots and more in cumulative pressure. Medieval fortifications were designed around assumptions that had remained largely valid for generations. Large artillery did not need to destroy an entire wall instantly. It only needed to create damage faster than defenders could fully repair it. Every impact mattered. Every crack mattered. Every weakened section forced defenders to commit resources and manpower. Over days and weeks, the balance gradually shifted. Historians continue debating the exact importance of Ottoman artillery during the siege. Some emphasize its decisive role. Others argue that factors such as manpower, logistics, leadership, naval operations, and tactical flexibility were equally important. The debate itself reveals something interesting. The fall of Constantinople was not the result of a single invention. Rather, it emerged from the interaction of many developments occurring at the same time. Technology created opportunities. Leadership exploited them. Resources sustained them. Strategy coordinated them. No single factor alone explains the outcome. Yet symbolism matters in history, and few symbols captured the changing nature of warfare more clearly than the giant bombard. For generations, walls had represented security. Now, a new generation was learning that even the strongest walls had limits. The implications extended far beyond Constantinople. Across Europe, rulers were watching. Military engineers were watching. Architects designing future fortifications were watching. The age of castles and medieval walls was not ending overnight, but it was entering a period of profound transformation. The old relationship between attacker and defender was beginning to change. In many ways, the siege of Constantinople would become one of the most famous demonstrations of that shift. Meanwhile, preparations continued relentlessly. Cannon foundries worked, supplies accumulated, soldiers gathered. The scale of the operation reflected the seriousness of Mehmed's intentions. This was not a raid. It was not a demonstration. It was not a diplomatic maneuver disguised as military pressure. It was a carefully planned campaign aimed at achieving a goal that had resisted countless previous attempts. The city understood the danger. Reports of Ottoman preparations circulated widely. Defenders strengthened vulnerable sections of the walls. Repairs were carried out where possible. Supplies were gathered. Yet even as preparations intensified, uncertainty remained. No one could know exactly how these new weapons would perform against fortifications that had survived for 1,000 years. History rarely provides controlled experiments. It provides moments when assumptions are tested under extreme conditions. The defenders trusted their walls because those walls had repeatedly proven themselves. The attackers trusted their artillery because it represented the future of warfare. Both sides had reasons for confidence. Both sides had reasons for concern. As winter gave way to spring, the atmosphere across the region grew increasingly tense. Travelers carried rumors. Merchants exchanged reports. Diplomats watched events unfold with growing interest. The coming confrontation felt different from earlier crises. Perhaps it was the scale of Ottoman preparations. Perhaps it was the determination of Mehmed himself. Perhaps it was the sense that larger historical forces were converging at a single point. Whatever the reason, many people understood that something extraordinary was approaching. The city still stood behind its famous walls. The empire that remained still hoped to survive. The great churches still filled with prayer. Yet, beyond the horizon, a new kind of threat was moving closer with every passing day. The giant cannon represented more than a weapon. It represented a challenge to assumptions that had endured for centuries. Soon, the question would no longer be theoretical. Soon, stone walls and gunpowder would meet face to face. And when the first Ottoman forces finally appeared before Constantinople in the spring of 1453, the world would begin to discover whether 1,000 years of history could withstand the force of a new age. By the spring of 1453, anticipation had given way to reality. For years, preparations, warnings, calculations, and rumors had pointed toward a confrontation that many people hoped would never come. Now there was no uncertainty left about what was happening. The army was coming. The fleet was coming. The artillery was coming. Beyond the walls of Constantinople, one of the most consequential sieges in history was about to begin. On April 6, 1453, the Ottoman army arrived before the city. Exact numbers remain a subject of debate among historians. Medieval chroniclers often exaggerated military figures, and modern estimates vary considerably. Some scholars place the Ottoman force at around 60,000 to 80,000 men, while others suggest it may have exceeded 100,000 when support personnel are included. Whatever the precise number, one fact is clear. The defenders faced overwhelming odds. Inside the city, the forces available to resist the assault were astonishingly small by comparison. Most estimates place the number of defenders at roughly 7,000 to 8,000 men, including Byzantine troops, foreign volunteers, and contingents led by experienced commanders such as Giovanni Giustiniani, a Genoese soldier whose arrival would prove critically important. The imbalance was obvious to everyone involved. One side possessed vast resources and numerical superiority. The other possessed walls, determination, and 1,000 years of defensive experience. Yet history has repeatedly shown that numbers alone do not determine outcomes. If they did, Constantinople would have fallen centuries earlier. Standing atop the walls, defenders could see the scale of the threat stretching across the landscape. Tents appeared across the countryside. Supply wagons moved into position. Military units established their camps. Standards fluttered in the wind. The city was not facing a raid or a temporary show of force. It was facing a carefully organized military machine assembled for a singular purpose. The sight must have been both terrifying and strangely familiar. Generations of Constantinople's inhabitants had watched enemy armies gather outside these walls. Their ancestors had survived such moments before. The difference was that this enemy appeared better prepared than any that had come before. Mehmed wasted little time. The siege began with methodical planning rather than reckless attacks. The giant cannons and other artillery pieces were positioned opposite key sections of the land walls. Engineers assessed terrain. Commanders coordinated units. Siege warfare at this scale required organization as much as courage. Every day demanded food, ammunition, communication, and discipline. The Ottoman army could not simply attack and hope for success. It needed to sustain pressure over time. This was where the city's defenders faced one of their greatest challenges. They were not merely fighting an enemy army. They were fighting the passage of time itself. Every day favored the larger force. Every day consumed supplies. Every day created new opportunities for accidents, fatigue, illness, and mistakes. Then the bombardment began. Contemporary accounts describe explosions unlike anything previous generations would have experienced. The great cannons roared across the landscape, sending massive stone projectiles crashing toward walls that had resisted countless enemies. The sound alone must have been extraordinary. Imagine centuries of accumulated confidence suddenly interrupted by impacts powerful enough to shake the ground beneath your feet. The walls did not collapse immediately. In fact, one of the most fascinating aspects of the siege is how resilient they remained. Modern audiences sometimes imagine artillery instantly reducing fortifications to rubble. The reality was far more complicated. The Theodosian Walls absorbed punishment with remarkable effectiveness. Massive stone structures built generations earlier continued performing their function. Yet every impact mattered. Cracks appeared. Masonry weakened. Sections required repair. Defenders worked constantly to patch damage under increasingly difficult conditions. What emerged was a battle of endurance. During the day, Ottoman artillery battered the walls. At night, defenders repaired them. Workers hauled stones. Soldiers reinforced weak points. Engineers improvised solutions. The cycle repeated itself again and again. Neither side achieved immediate success. Instead, the siege became a contest between destruction and repair. This dynamic reveals an important truth about the fall of Constantinople. The city did not simply collapse under overwhelming force. It fought, it adapted, it resisted. Every day of survival represented an achievement against extraordinary odds. Leadership played a crucial role. Emperor Constantine XI, the final Byzantine emperor, remained inside the city throughout the siege. Historical sources portray him as determined and active in organizing the defense. Accounts differ in certain details, as medieval sources often do, but the broader picture is consistent. He did not flee. He did not seek safety elsewhere. He remained with the city he was trying to save. That decision carried symbolic importance. During moments of crisis, leadership often becomes as much about morale as strategy. The defenders needed reasons to continue believing resistance was possible. Constantine's presence helped provide one of those reasons. Alongside him stood experienced military figures such as Giustiniani, whose expertise strengthened key sections of the defense. Yet even the most capable leaders could not change basic realities. The defenders were vastly outnumbered. Every casualty hurt. Every damaged section of wall created new vulnerabilities. Every day increased the strain. Meanwhile, the Ottoman army possessed resources that allowed it to maintain pressure. This difference became one of the defining features of the siege. The defenders needed to succeed every day. The attackers needed to succeed only once. Still, the city refused to yield. In some respects, the opening weeks of the siege may have surprised Mehmed. The artillery caused damage, but not enough to guarantee immediate victory. Assaults encountered fierce resistance. The walls continued standing. The defenders continued repairing them. What looked straightforward on paper was proving far more difficult in reality. This should not have been entirely unexpected. Constantinople's reputation existed for a reason. The city had accumulated centuries of experience confronting exactly this kind of danger. Yet the very fact that the siege did not end quickly may have increased pressure on both sides. For the defenders, prolonged resistance created hope. If they could hold out long enough, perhaps relief might arrive. Perhaps divisions would emerge among the attackers. Perhaps weather, disease, logistics, or diplomacy might alter events. Such hopes were not irrational. History contains many examples of seemingly doomed cities surviving because circumstances changed unexpectedly. For the Ottomans, however, time represented both an advantage and a risk. Large armies consumed enormous quantities of resources. Maintaining discipline grew more challenging as campaigns lengthened. Momentum mattered. Mehmed needed progress. This tension gave the siege a fascinating psychological dimension. Each side interpreted events through a different lens. When a wall section remained standing, defenders saw resilience. Attackers saw an obstacle that would eventually break. When repairs succeeded overnight, defenders saw determination. Attackers saw evidence that more pressure was required. The same events generated different conclusions depending on perspective. Such moments remind us that historical participants never know how the story ends. They experience uncertainty just as we do in our own lives. Looking back, it is easy to identify patterns. Living through them is far more difficult. Inside Constantinople, daily life increasingly revolved around survival. Religious ceremonies took on heightened significance. Citizens gathered information, shared rumors, and watched developments with growing anxiety. Every explosion echoed through the city. Every report from the walls carried weight. Yet ordinary life did not disappear completely. People still needed food. Families still remained together. Conversations continued. Hope persisted. One of the remarkable aspects of human history is the ability of communities to maintain routines even in the shadow of catastrophe. Outside the walls, Ottoman commanders evaluated progress and considered new approaches. It was becoming increasingly clear that artillery alone might not be enough. The walls were suffering damage, but they were not collapsing in the decisive manner some may have expected. This realization would soon encourage the search for additional strategies. If Constantinople could not be defeated through a single method, it would need to be attacked through multiple avenues at once. Land operations, artillery pressure, naval actions, engineering projects, and psychological warfare would all become increasingly important. The siege was evolving, and as it evolved, so did the stakes. Because with every passing day, both sides were discovering something unexpected. The defenders were learning that the walls could still withstand astonishing punishment. The attackers were learning that persistence alone might not guarantee victory. The city remained under immense pressure, but it was not broken. The Ottoman army remained powerful, but it had not achieved its objective. The struggle had entered a new phase, and soon Mehmed would make a decision so bold that even some of his own commanders reportedly questioned it. It was a move that would bypass assumptions centuries old and force Constantinople to confront a danger from a direction many believed was secure. The walls had not yet fallen. The city still stood. But the battlefield itself was about to change. The siege had already become a test of endurance. But another problem was beginning to frustrate Mehmed's plans. The walls remained standing. The defenders continued repairing damage. Most importantly, one of the city's greatest natural advantages was still working exactly as intended. The Golden Horn remained largely secure. For centuries, this deep natural harbor had functioned as both an economic lifeline and a defensive asset. It allowed ships to anchor in relative safety while providing the city with access to the sea. Protecting it was a massive iron chain stretched across the harbor entrance, a barrier so famous that it had become part of Constantinople's defensive identity. The concept was simple but effective. Enemy ships could not easily force their way through. As long as the chain remained intact and the harbor remained protected, the city retained a crucial connection to the outside world. This mattered far more than many people realize. Sieges are rarely won by attacking walls alone. They are won by isolating a city, exhausting its resources, and eliminating its options. The Golden Horn complicated all of those objectives. Ottoman forces controlled much of the surrounding territory, yet complete control remained frustratingly out of reach. The harbor represented a weakness in the blockade, and Mehmed understood that every weakness mattered. The situation became even more embarrassing for the Ottomans after a dramatic naval encounter in April 1453. Several Christian ships carrying supplies managed to fight their way through Ottoman naval forces and enter the harbor. Contemporary accounts vary in their descriptions, as they often do, but the psychological impact appears undeniable. Defenders celebrated. Observers inside the city gained renewed confidence. Meanwhile, Mehmed reportedly reacted with visible anger. Whether every detail recorded by chroniclers is accurate remains difficult to determine, but the broader lesson was clear. Numerical superiority alone was not guaranteeing success. The city was still finding ways to resist. The harbor was still functioning. Time was still passing. From Mehmed's perspective, this was unacceptable. One of the most revealing aspects of leadership during crises is how individuals respond when initial plans fail to produce the desired results. Some become cautious. Others become reckless. Mehmed chose a different path. Rather than abandoning the problem, he began searching for a solution that many would have considered impossible. The challenge was obvious. The chain blocked direct naval access to the Golden Horn. If the fleet could not pass through the entrance, perhaps it could reach the harbor another way. At first glance, the idea sounds absurd. Ships belong in water. The Golden Horn was separated from Ottoman-controlled waters by land. Yet history occasionally rewards people willing to question assumptions that everyone else accepts. The exact origins of the plan remain somewhat unclear. Historians continue discussing how much of the idea came directly from Mehmed, how much emerged from advisors, and how much reflected existing military practices adapted to an extraordinary situation. Moving ships overland was not entirely unprecedented in world history. Various cultures had transported vessels across short distances when necessary. What made this operation remarkable was its scale, timing, and strategic impact. The terrain north of the Golden Horn included hills, forests, and uneven ground. Transporting large vessels across such conditions presented enormous logistical challenges. Yet, preparations began. Workers gathered timber. Pathways were prepared. Surfaces were reportedly lubricated with grease or oil to reduce friction. Engineers organized routes. Laborers, soldiers, animals, and support personnel coordinated efforts that required careful planning rather than brute force alone. This is one of the moments where the siege begins to feel almost cinematic. Imagine the scene unfolding during the night. Teams of workers hauling ships through darkness, wooden rollers positioned beneath hulls, commands echoing through the hills, ropes straining under immense pressure. Men working not merely to move cargo, but to alter the strategic geography of an entire battlefield. The operation represented a fusion of engineering, determination, and imagination. Whether every vessel moved exactly as later accounts describe remains a subject of discussion among historians. Medieval chroniclers sometimes amplified dramatic details, yet the essential fact is not disputed. Ottoman ships were successfully transported overland and launched into the Golden Horn. The consequences were immediate. According to multiple accounts, residents of Constantinople awoke to a shocking sight. Ottoman vessels now appeared inside waters many had considered relatively secure. The psychological impact may have been as significant as the military one. Defenses that seemed reliable suddenly appeared vulnerable. Assumptions that had survived for generations were being challenged. The operation demonstrated something important about Mehmed's approach to warfare. He was not interested in attacking only where his enemies expected. He was willing to redefine the problem itself. This mindset often separates ordinary commanders from exceptional ones. The most effective leaders do not simply react to obstacles, they find ways around them. Yet, Despite its dramatic nature, the operation did not instantly determine the outcome of the siege. This point is worth emphasizing because popular retellings sometimes present the event as a decisive turning point that immediately doomed the city. Reality appears more complex. Ottoman ships inside the Golden Horn created new pressures, but Constantinople did not collapse. Defenders adapted. Resistance continued. The city remained standing. What changed was the strategic environment. Suddenly, the defenders faced threats from additional directions. Resources had to be redistributed. Attention had to be divided. Every new challenge increased strain on a defense already operating under extreme pressure. The cumulative effect mattered. One of the recurring themes throughout the siege is that no single event alone explains what happened. Instead, pressure accumulated gradually. Artillery weakened walls. Blockades restricted movement. Assaults tested defenses. Naval operations created new vulnerabilities. Each individual challenge might have been manageable. Together, they became increasingly difficult to resist. The arrival of Ottoman ships in the Golden Horn fits this pattern perfectly. It was not a magical solution. It was another layer of pressure applied to a city already struggling to withstand multiple threats simultaneously. The operation also highlights a broader historical question. To what extent do major historical outcomes depend on technology? And to what extent do they depend on creativity? The ships themselves were not new. The harbor was not new. The land route was not new. What made the event extraordinary was the willingness to combine existing elements in an unexpected way. History often celebrates inventions, but sometimes the most important breakthroughs emerge from seeing familiar things differently. Mehmed's overland naval maneuver remains memorable partly because it illustrates this principle so clearly. As the siege continued, the defenders attempted countermeasures. Raids were planned. Naval actions occurred. Efforts were made to disrupt Ottoman positions. Some succeeded. Others failed. Yet the broader trend was becoming difficult to ignore. The initiative increasingly belonged to the attackers. They possessed greater manpower. They possessed greater resources. They possessed greater flexibility. Every week seemed to generate another challenge for the defenders. Still, Constantinople endured. That endurance remains remarkable. Many cities facing similar circumstances would have surrendered. Many populations would have lost hope. Yet the defenders continued repairing walls, organizing resistance, and preparing for whatever came next. Their determination prolonged the struggle far beyond what simple calculations of numbers might have predicted. Perhaps this is one reason the story continues to fascinate people centuries later. The siege was not merely a contest between strength and weakness. It was a contest between two extraordinary acts of will. One side refused to abandon its dream of conquest. The other refused to abandon its determination to survive. The movement of ships over land became one of the most famous moments because it captured the spirit of that confrontation. It demonstrated how far the attackers were willing to go. It revealed how rapidly old assumptions were breaking down. Most importantly, it signaled that the siege had entered a new and even more dangerous phase. The city still stood behind its walls. The defenders still held their positions. But the sense of security surrounding the Golden Horn had been shattered. The battlefield had changed. The rules had changed. And as the pressure mounted from every direction, the people inside Constantinople were beginning to realize that they might soon face a question their ancestors had spent centuries avoiding. What happens when every layer of protection that once seemed permanent begins to fail at the same time? As the siege dragged deeper into May 1453, something subtle but profound began to change inside Constantinople. The city was still standing. The walls had not fallen. Defenders continued resisting every attack. Yet survival and victory were no longer viewed as the same thing. For weeks, people had lived with uncertainty. They had hoped for relief fleets. They had hoped for diplomatic intervention. They had hoped that weather, fortune, or some unexpected development might alter the course of events. But as days passed and no miracle appeared on the horizon, a growing number of people began confronting a possibility that few had wanted to speak aloud. The city might not survive. The realization did not arrive all at once. It emerged gradually, like a shadow lengthening across a landscape. What makes the final days of Constantinople so fascinating is that they reveal not only military history, but human psychology under extraordinary pressure. Every civilization eventually reaches moments when the future becomes uncertain and the past suddenly feels very close. By the late stages of the siege, Constantinople was no longer simply defending walls. It was defending memory, identity, and a legacy stretching back more than 1,000 years. Walking through the city during those days must have felt surreal. The same streets that had witnessed imperial processions, religious festivals, commercial triumphs, and centuries of daily life now existed under the constant threat of destruction. Markets still operated, but with growing tension. Religious services continued, but with heightened urgency. Conversations increasingly revolved around rumors, predictions, and reports from the walls. Every messenger attracted attention. Every new development carried emotional weight. The city was trapped in a strange state between normal life and approaching catastrophe. Yet perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this period was how ordinary many moments probably felt. Children still lived within the city. Families still shared meals. Friends still spoke with one another. Human beings possess an extraordinary ability to continue living even when surrounded by uncertainty. That resilience often becomes invisible in historical narratives focused on emperors and battles. But it may be one of the most important parts of the story. While soldiers watched the walls, thousands of civilians faced their own version of the siege, one built from fear, hope, and waiting. Emperor Constantine XI remained at the center of this unfolding drama. Historical accounts consistently portray him as active and engaged during the city's final days. He attended defensive preparations, consulted military leaders, and participated in efforts to maintain morale. Perhaps most importantly, he remained visible. Leadership during a crisis often depends as much on presence as decision-making. A ruler who disappears creates uncertainty. A ruler who remains can become a symbol. Constantine increasingly represented something larger than himself. He was no longer merely an emperor governing a shrinking state. He had become the living embodiment of a civilization fighting for survival. Whether he viewed his role in such dramatic terms is impossible to know. Yet many around him almost certainly did. One of the most intriguing aspects of the final days involves the role of signs, omens, and interpretations of unusual events. Medieval societies often viewed history through spiritual as well as political lenses. Natural phenomena could be interpreted as messages, warnings, or indications of divine favor. During the siege, several events attracted attention among the city's inhabitants. One of the most frequently discussed involved a lunar eclipse that occurred on May 22, 1453. To modern observers, lunar eclipses are predictable astronomical events. To many people living in the 15th century, however, they could carry symbolic significance. Some residents reportedly viewed the eclipse as a troubling sign. Whether such interpretations were widespread or limited to particular groups remains uncertain, but contemporary sources suggest the event generated concern. It is easy to dismiss such reactions from a modern perspective, yet doing so risks missing something important. Human beings often search for meaning during moments of crisis. When uncertainty becomes overwhelming, people naturally look for patterns that might help explain what is happening. The eclipse provided one such pattern. Another event soon followed. Several accounts describe unusual atmospheric phenomena around Hagia Sophia, the city's most famous church. Some reports mention mysterious lights or glows surrounding parts of the structure. Historians and scientists have proposed various explanations over the years. Certain descriptions may reflect atmospheric conditions, reflections, weather-related optical effects, or later embellishments introduced by chroniclers. There is no universal agreement. What matters historically is not necessarily what happened in a scientific sense, but how people interpreted it at the time. To some residents, these reports seemed ominous. To others, they may have represented signs of protection or hope. The ambiguity itself is revealing. During moments of uncertainty, the same event can generate entirely different meanings depending on who is observing it. Beyond questions of omens and signs lay a more immediate reality. The city's resources were under immense strain. Defenders were exhausted. Repairs continued, but every day made the task harder. Casualties accumulated. Sleep became scarce. Constant vigilance created physical and emotional fatigue. One of the least visible aspects of siege warfare is exhaustion. Battles often receive the most attention, yet fatigue can become just as dangerous. Tired soldiers make mistakes. Tired workers move more slowly. Tired communities struggle to maintain morale. By the final weeks of the siege, nearly everyone inside Constantinople was carrying some degree of exhaustion. The remarkable fact is not that they were tired. The remarkable fact is that they continued resisting despite it. Religious life assumed increasing importance as uncertainty deepened. Churches filled with worshippers seeking comfort, guidance, or reassurance. Public prayers became more common. Processions moved through parts of the city. Different individuals undoubtedly approached these moments in different ways. Some may have felt strengthened. Others may have felt frightened. Still others may have experienced both emotions simultaneously. History often portrays societies as unified during crises, but reality is usually more complicated. People respond differently to the same circumstances. What united many residents was not identical beliefs, but a shared awareness that they were living through something extraordinary. Outside the walls, Mehmed faced his own pressures. The siege had lasted longer than many expected. Although Ottoman forces maintained significant advantages, victory was not automatic. Every additional day required resources. Every failed assault carried costs. Large armies were powerful, but they were also demanding. Commanders needed progress. Soldiers needed confidence. momentum mattered. The existence of these pressures helps explain why Ottoman strategy increasingly focused on creating opportunities for a decisive breakthrough. The siege had become a contest between endurance and inevitability. Defenders hoped endurance might somehow alter the future. Attackers increasingly sought inevitability. As May approached its final days, reports suggest that preparations intensified on both sides. Defensive positions were reinforced. Plans were reviewed. Weapons were distributed. Military leaders assessed vulnerable points. There was a growing sense that a major confrontation was approaching. Even people without direct access to strategic information could likely feel the atmosphere changing. Cities under siege develop their own rhythms. The final days often feel different from those that came before. Conversations become shorter. Rumors spread faster. Attention focuses increasingly on immediate events rather than distant possibilities. Constantinople appears to have entered such a phase. Hope had not vanished, but it was increasingly competing with realism. The city's inhabitants understood the danger. What they did not know was exactly when the decisive moment would arrive. Then came one of the most poignant scenes in the entire story. On the evening of May 28th, the city gathered for what many understood might be its final night. Religious services were held. People prayed together. Contemporary accounts describe an atmosphere combining solemnity, uncertainty, and resolve. Some details vary across sources, as often happens with events recorded under emotional circumstances. Yet the broader image remains powerful. A community facing an uncertain dawn came together beneath monuments that had witnessed centuries of history. It is difficult not to feel the emotional weight of that moment. Generations had lived, worshipped, traded, celebrated, and mourned within these walls. Now the future of everything seemed to hang in the balance. Meanwhile, beyond the city, Ottoman forces completed preparations of their own. Soldiers assembled, orders circulated, commanders coordinated final plans. The long siege was approaching its climax. Both sides understood that the next phase would likely determine the outcome. There would be no more time for gradual adjustments, no more opportunities to postpone the decision. The struggle that had consumed weeks was narrowing toward a single point. Night settled over Constantinople. Fires burned in camps outside the walls. Prayers echoed through churches inside them. Somewhere in the darkness, thousands of people lay awake, wondering what the morning would bring. Some hoped for survival. Some feared the worst. Most probably experienced a mixture of emotions impossible to separate neatly. The city still stood. The walls still stood. The empire still stood. But for the first time in more than 1,000 years, many people sensed that dawn might bring the final test. And when the sun rose on May 29th, 1453, history would move faster than it had in generations. Before sunrise on May 29th, 1453, Constantinople existed in a strange space between survival and oblivion. The city still stood. Its walls still stretched across the landscape. Its defenders still occupied their positions. Yet everyone understood that the coming hours would likely decide the fate of a civilization that traced its roots back to the Roman Empire itself. The long siege had narrowed into a single moment. Weeks of artillery bombardment, engineering projects, naval maneuvers, failed assaults, desperate repairs, and relentless pressure were about to culminate in one final effort. Somewhere beyond the walls, thousands of Ottoman soldiers prepared for battle in the darkness. Inside the city, exhausted defenders tightened armor, checked weapons, and waited. Few could have known exactly how the day would unfold. Many probably understood that they might not live to see its end. The Ottoman attack began before dawn. Historical accounts differ in certain details, as is often the case with chaotic events witnessed from multiple perspectives. But most agree that Mehmed organized the assault in waves. This approach served several purposes. Early attacks could exhaust defenders, reveal weaknesses, and force the defenders to expend energy and resources before more experienced troops entered the fight. The first assaults pressed forward against the damaged sections of the walls. Arrows filled the air. Artillery continued firing where possible. Shouts echoed across the battlefield. The defenders resisted fiercely. For weeks they had lived under constant strain, yet they still managed to repel attackers climbing, pushing, and fighting their way toward the breaches. In many historical retellings, the fall of Constantinople can seem inevitable. Standing on the battlefield that morning, however, nothing would have felt inevitable. The outcome remained uncertain. Battles often hinge on moments that appear insignificant while they are happening. Fatigue, confusion, communication failures, individual acts of courage, and simple chance can all influence events in ways no commander fully controls. This reality becomes especially important when examining the final hours of the siege. The defenders were vastly outnumbered, but they still possessed advantages. They knew the terrain. They fought from prepared positions. They had spent weeks adapting to pressure. Every failed Ottoman assault reinforced the possibility that the city might somehow survive a little longer. Yet, every success by the defenders came at a cost. Men were wounded. Ammunition was consumed. Physical exhaustion deepened. Time, which had once been an ally of the city's walls, was becoming increasingly dangerous. Among the most important figures in the defense was Giovanni Giustiniani. Throughout the siege, he had played a major role in organizing resistance around critical sections of the fortifications. Contemporary sources indicate that during the final assault, he suffered a serious injury. Exactly how the wound occurred and how events unfolded afterward remains the subject of historical discussion. But many accounts agree that his departure from the battlefield had a significant effect on morale. Leadership matters during crises. When experienced commanders disappear at critical moments, uncertainty often spreads quickly. Even if the military consequences are difficult to measure precisely, the psychological consequences can be enormous. The defenders were already operating under extraordinary pressure. Any disruption mattered. Meanwhile, the Ottoman attacks continued. Wave after wave pressed against weakened sections of the walls. This is where one of history's most debated episodes enters the story. For centuries, historians have discussed the role of a small gate known as Cercoporta. According to certain later accounts, the gate may have been left open or insufficiently secured, allowing Ottoman troops to enter the city at a critical moment. Other historians remain skeptical, pointing out that surviving evidence is limited and sometimes contradictory. Some argue that the story emerged later as an attempt to explain a catastrophe that people struggled to comprehend. The truth may never be known with complete certainty. What makes the Cercoporta story fascinating is not merely whether it happened exactly as described, but what it reveals about human reactions to disaster. People often search for a single explanation when complex systems fail. A forgotten gate feels easier to understand than weeks of cumulative pressure, exhaustion, damage, and overwhelming force. Whether Cercoporta played a decisive role or not, the broader reality remains clear. Ottoman forces eventually breached the defenses and established positions inside the city. Once that process began, the situation changed rapidly. Defensive systems designed to keep enemies out became far less effective once enemies were already within them. Fighting spread, confusion increased, communication became more difficult. The carefully organized defense that had held for weeks started to fragment. At that point, the city faced a challenge that walls could no longer solve. Emperor Constantine XI entered the final chapter of his own story during these chaotic hours. Historical sources offer varying details regarding his last moments. What appears broadly accepted is that he chose to remain with the defenders rather than flee. Beyond that, certainty becomes elusive. Some accounts suggest he removed imperial insignia before entering combat, perhaps to avoid identification. Others describe different circumstances. No universally accepted eyewitness account exists that resolves every question. In fact, one of the most enduring mysteries surrounding the fall of Constantinople concerns exactly how the last Byzantine emperor died. His body was never identified with complete certainty in a way that satisfies all historians. Various stories emerged in the aftermath. Some claimed his remains were found and recognized. Others proposed alternative interpretations. Over time, legends developed. One tradition suggested that he had not truly died, but would someday return. Such stories are not unusual following the collapse of a state or dynasty. Communities experiencing traumatic loss often create narratives that preserve hope or meaning. Whether viewed as folklore, symbolism, or emotional response, these legends reveal how deeply the event affected those who lived through it. By mid-morning, the battle was effectively decided. Ottoman forces secured increasing portions of the city. Resistance continued in some locations, but the strategic outcome was becoming clear. The city that had resisted Persians, Arabs, Bulgars, Rus, Crusaders, and countless other threats across more than 1,000 years had finally been overcome. Yet, even here, the story resists simple interpretation. It is tempting to describe the fall as the triumph of a new age over an old one. There is some truth in that idea. Gunpowder weapons had demonstrated their importance. New political powers had emerged. Military realities were changing. At the same time, reducing the event to a single symbolic transition risks oversimplifying it. Constantinople did not fall because one invention suddenly made walls obsolete, nor did it fall solely because of one battle. Its collapse resulted from centuries of political, economic, military, and demographic transformations converging at a single moment. The final assault mattered because of everything that came before it. As Ottoman troops entered the city, the emotional significance of the event extended far beyond immediate military victory. Mehmed had achieved what generations of rulers had failed to accomplish. The conquest elevated his status dramatically and transformed his place in history. For the defenders, however, the experience must have felt profoundly different. entire ways of understanding the world were collapsing in real time. Institutions that traced their origins back centuries were ending. Familiar assumptions no longer applied. Such moments are difficult to comprehend because they occur so rarely. Most people live their entire lives without witnessing the end of a civilization. The inhabitants of Constantinople did not have that luxury. They were living through it. One of the most powerful images associated with the fall involves Hagia Sophia. Various accounts describe people gathering there during the final stages of the city's collapse. Some details may have been shaped by later retellings, and historians continue evaluating the reliability of individual sources. But the symbolic importance is undeniable. For centuries, the building had represented continuity, faith, and imperial prestige. Now, it stood at the center of a transformed reality. By the afternoon, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The Ottoman banner flew over the city. The siege was over. The city had fallen. Yet the deeper significance of that moment would take much longer to unfold. People living through historical turning points rarely understand their full consequences immediately. They experience confusion, relief, grief, celebration, fear, or exhaustion long before they understand the broader implications. Those implications would echo across Europe, the Mediterranean, and beyond for generations. But on that day, one fact stood above all others. The last great capital of the Roman world had been conquered. A chapter stretching back more than a millennium had come to an end. The walls still stood. Hagia Sophia still stood. The Bosphorus still flowed between continents. Yet the world that had given those things their meaning had changed forever. And as news spread across distant kingdoms and cities, people struggled to comprehend what many had once considered impossible. Constantinople had fallen. When people imagine the fall of a great city, they often picture a single dramatic moment. A gate breaks. An army enters. A flag changes. A ruler dies. History seems to divide itself neatly into before and after. Yet the most important consequences of historical events rarely appear on the day they happen. They emerge gradually, spreading outward across years, decades, and sometimes centuries. This is especially true for Constantinople. On May 29, 1453, the city fell. But the story did not end there. In many ways, the most fascinating chapter was only beginning. The first thing to understand is that Constantinople did not vanish. The walls remained. The harbors remained. The churches, markets, streets, and monuments remained. Even many of the people remained. What changed was the political world surrounding them. The city that had served as the last capital of the Roman Empire became the prize of a rising Ottoman state. Over time, Constantinople would evolve into one of the most important cities of the Ottoman world and eventually become known globally as Istanbul. This transformation is one reason the story continues to captivate historians. The city was not destroyed and forgotten like some ancient capitals. Instead, it survived by becoming something new. That process raises an intriguing question. When does a city stop being itself? Is a city defined by its rulers, its buildings, its people, its traditions? The answer depends partly on perspective. Standing in modern Istanbul today, visitors can still see remnants of multiple civilizations layered atop one another. Roman foundations, Byzantine structures, Ottoman architecture, and modern development coexist within the same urban landscape. In a sense, the city contains several histories at once. Mehmed understood the value of what he had captured. Contrary to the image sometimes presented in simplified narratives, he was not interested in ruling over an empty ruin. He wanted a thriving capital. Historical evidence suggests that he took active steps to restore population, encourage economic activity, and transform the city into the administrative and symbolic center of his empire. Markets reopened, new residents arrived, construction projects expanded, institutions adapted. The process was not immediate, nor was it always smooth, but the broader direction was clear. The conqueror intended to make the city central to the future, rather than leave it trapped in the past. This decision would have enormous consequences. Instead of becoming a monument to decline, the city entered another period of significance. Yet, the fall of Constantinople affected far more than the city itself. News of the conquest spread rapidly across Europe. For many observers, the event felt shocking, even though the Byzantine Empire had been weakening for centuries. The symbolic weight of the city mattered. Constantinople was not just another capital. It represented continuity with Rome, Christianity, and a historical tradition stretching back more than a millennium. Its fall forced people to confront uncomfortable realities about power, change, and vulnerability. States that appear permanent are not permanent. Institutions that survive for centuries can still disappear. The lesson was unsettling because it challenged assumptions that many people preferred to believe. One of the most frequently discussed questions surrounding the fall concerns its relationship to the Renaissance. Popular accounts sometimes claim that Byzantine scholars fled westward after the conquest and directly triggered a cultural transformation in Europe. Reality appears more nuanced. Renaissance developments were already underway before 1453. Interest in classical learning existed long before the city's fall. Yet it is also true that Greek-speaking scholars, manuscripts, and intellectual traditions played an important role in transmitting knowledge across cultural boundaries. The conquest may have accelerated certain exchanges and encouraged additional movement of people and texts. Historians continue debating the scale of this influence. Some emphasize it strongly. Others view it as one factor among many. What seems clear is that the fall contributed to broader intellectual connections between different regions. It did not create the Renaissance by itself, but it became part of a larger story involving cultural transmission and rediscovery. Another enduring question involves exploration. Some traditional narratives suggest that the Ottoman control of key trade routes encouraged European powers to search for alternative paths to Asia, ultimately contributing to the age of exploration. Once again, reality is more complicated than a single cause and effect relationship. Trade continued after 1453. Economic networks adapted rather than disappearing. Nevertheless, shifting political conditions did influence strategic thinking. European states increasingly explored maritime possibilities that might reduce dependence on existing routes. The search for new connections across oceans emerged from multiple motivations, including profit, competition, technology, and geography. The fall of Constantinople may not have single-handedly launched the age of exploration, but it formed part of the environment in which such decisions became increasingly attractive. Sometimes, historical significance emerges not from one direct consequence, but from a collection of subtle influences pushing events in similar directions. The Ottoman Empire itself also changed as a result of the conquest. Capturing Constantinople elevated Ottoman prestige dramatically. The victory reinforced the empire's status as a major power and strengthened its position within regional politics. Mehmed acquired not only territory, but legitimacy. The conquest allowed him to present himself as the ruler of a city whose name carried extraordinary historical resonance. This mattered because empires are built not only on military victories, but on stories. Rulers seek narratives that justify authority and inspire loyalty. Few stories were more powerful than the conquest of Constantinople. The city became both a practical capital and a symbol. Yet, perhaps the most fascinating legacy of Constantinople is the way it continues to exist in collective memory. More than 5 centuries later, people still debate its meaning. Was 1453 the end of the Middle Ages? Some historians support that interpretation, while others view such labels as oversimplifications. Was the city truly the last Roman capital? In many respects, yes, yet even that statement invites discussion about how we define continuity and identity. Was its fall inevitable? Historians remain divided. Looking backward, patterns can appear obvious. Looking forward from the perspective of those living at the time, the future was far less certain. Alternative outcomes always existed. Different decisions, different alliances, different circumstances might have altered events. History is rarely predetermined. The survival of these debates helps explain why the story remains compelling. The fall of Constantinople is not merely a tale about military conquest. It is a story about transformation. The city changed, the region changed, the balance of power changed, yet many things endured as well. Languages survived, traditions survived, buildings survived, memories survived. Human history often operates through this combination of loss and continuity. One world ends while another emerges from its foundations. Few places illustrate that process more clearly than Constantinople. Even the famous question of whether the Roman Empire truly ended in 1453 invites reflection. From one perspective, the answer seems obvious. The last Roman emperor died. The last Roman capital fell. The political structure disappeared. Yet aspects of Roman law, Roman administration, Roman ideas, and Roman influence continued shaping societies long afterward. The empire ended. Its legacy did not. Perhaps that distinction matters more than we often realize. Civilizations rarely vanish completely. They leave traces in architecture, institutions, language, culture, and memory. those traces continue influencing the future long after political borders disappear. Today, visitors standing beside the Bosphorus can watch ships move between continents just as they have for centuries. They can walk beneath walls that once resisted armies. They can enter Hagia Sophia and stand beneath the same vast dome that inspired awe in generations of travelers. The city has changed names, rulers, religions, languages, and political systems, yet it remains one of the most important urban centers on Earth. That continuity may be the most remarkable legacy of all. The conquerors changed, the empires changed, the world changed, but the city endured. And perhaps that is the final irony of the story. For centuries, people believed Constantinople was immortal because its walls could not be broken. In the end, the walls were breached. The empire fell. The age that created the city came to an end. Yet the city itself survived, not unchanged, not untouched, but alive. The last Roman capital disappeared, yet its streets continued filling with people. Its harbors continued welcoming ships. Its skyline continued shaping the horizon. History moved on, but it did not erase what came before. And that may be why the story of Constantinople continues to resonate centuries later. It reminds us that while empires rise and fall, the places where human lives unfold often outlast the political worlds built around them. The Roman Empire ended. The city remained. And in many ways, it is still telling its story today. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the rise and fall of Constantinople. If you enjoyed tonight's story, please subscribe to Mystery Sleep Forget, and may your evening be peaceful as history gently fades into dreams.